Please sit down. Good evening to you. You look as though you need a sit down. I wonder, as you arrived in your chalet with your suitcase there, you threw open the cupboard, had your coat hangers been raptured? Was this the moment when you figured that the second coming for coat hangers had happened and you were bereft? Is that true for you? I thought you'd like to know that I've been here for the past 2 weeks and I moved chalets today and I discovered coat hanger heaven. So if nothing else good happens tonight and you need a few spare coat hangers, I've emptied my chalet for you. If you come forward for those, I want to assure you no one will pray with you, no one will lay hands on you, no one will slay you in the spirit, no one will ask you to sign a covenant form for the Evangelical Alliance or anything like that. You are safe tonight. It occurred to me as well, in a week like this, there's a danger that you might go through it and learn absolutely nothing. So I thought we might just be safe for a minute. So I thought the very least I could do is give you 10 tips that any child would tell you about life. If you can get hold of these, then you will survive. Number one, no matter how hard you try, you cannot baptize cats. When your mum and dad are mad with each other, don't let your mother brush your hair. I had a very troubled childhood. Yes, you figured it out. Number three, if your sister hits you, do not hit her back because they always catch the second person. Never ask your 3-year-old brother to hold a tomato. Kids' wisdom, you cannot trust a dog to guard your food. Another personal one, this, do not sneeze when someone is cutting your hair. Puppies still have bad breath even when you've given them a mint. You can't hide a piece of broccoli in a glass of milk. Who's tried that? Come on, who's tried that? Let's have an appeal now. And my favorite, the best place to be when you're sad is in Grandma's lap. Isn't that nice? Kids' tips on life. It was about 3 winters ago that 2 men in Michigan, America, set out on a duck shooting expedition. It was winter, the lake was frozen. They set out with their guns, their decoy duck, a stick of dynamite to blow a hole in the ice, ready to find a place where the ducks could land with a decoy in it. Their dog, the brand new cheap Cherokee, on which was worth about $30,000, and which they just made their first payment. They set out, got onto the ice, which was thick and safe because they were wise men. And they took the stick of dynamite, which was a safe way to blow a hole in a piece of ice. But they were wise enough to realize that the fuse on the dynamite was only about 40 seconds, which meant if you lit the fuse and left the stick of dynamite where it was, and then made yourself in an orderly direction away from it, you were unlikely to travel far enough on ice for safety. So they were clever. They lit the fuse and threw the dynamite. Did you remember I mentioned a dog? It was a retriever. Highly trained, wet nose, floppy ears, waggy tail, which scampered off in the direction of the dynamite and soon was turning back, happy, exalted, saying, "Aren't I a good dog?" and rushed towards these geniuses of the human race. It was at that one point, one said to the other, "We better shoot it, shoot it, shoot it." Now, duck pellets do no damage to dogs. If you're a duck, you're in trouble, but if you're a dog, you're quite safe. But under that sort of attack, you immediately look for somewhere to take shelter. You are ahead of me, aren't you? And so this dog sheltered under the £30,000 brand new Jeep Cherokee, on which only one payment had been made and wasn't insured should it sink to the bottom of lakes. And at that point, there was a loud explosion, and it did. There's a lot of men here really worried about their car, and a number of women really worried about the dog. Such is life. So let me put your mind at rest, ladies. The dog lived. Not for very long. That is a true story. It comes from the Darwin Awards, which are issued every year. And I love them. Because they remind me that sometimes days don't turn out the way we intend them to turn out. You probably had one of those today. You took the coastal road, and just at that moment, when heaven had left the car, you passed that little village called Bicker. Did you find that village? Wasn't it symbolic? I'm glad it didn't say kill him. You know, you'd have probably done it. The other brave thing that children never ask is why men never ask the way. And you understand that too. Moses had one of these days. He set out to do something very normal, very sane, and found himself talking to a burning bush. Some days don't turn out the way we expect them to do. But God used a burning bush to get his attention. I don't know who in that story I've just told you, which is true, you identify with most as you sit here tonight. Two foolish people who thought they knew better. Something sink in the bottom, never to drive again. People whose lives are not working the way you'd like them to work. I don't know who you identify with. But here is Moses, whose attention has been caught by God on a day which started out in a very ordinary way. In fact, I wonder how different that day was from any one of the previous days across 40 years, when he had gone out just simply to tend the sheep, just going about his business. But there in the backside of the desert, God got his attention. I wonder how hard it was for God to get his attention. I can imagine Moses worrying about his people that he'd seen in such suffering and pain. I can imagine Moses being distraught at the fact that he had killed someone he shouldn't kill, and because he'd been discovered had to run away for safety. I can imagine a Moses distraught because he was now no longer a Jew but recognized as an Egyptian. He was no longer the person in the royal palace that he deserved to be, but he simply could do no more than do the menial, brainless task, day after day after day after day, of minding sheep. I wonder how hard God had tried to work to get his attention, and how hard he finds it to get ours. Because it seems to me we can spend many, many days worshiping, filling our minds with all kinds of things which are wonderful and glorious about God, but somehow he still never really gets our attention. Do you know what I mean? And here's Moses going about things, and we read in that reading we had tonight from Exodus 2, God got Moses' attention. And probably one of the greatest opportunities of coming to Spring Harvest is here is a chance for God to get our attention. Here's Moses at the backside of the desert. Here's you at the backside of England. I'm sorry for day visitors from Skegness, but we are a long way from big cities, bright lights. You've made a long journey, just as Moses made a long journey into the desert. And in a sense, spring harvest is your burning bush. In a sense, spring harvest is the place where God has the opportunity to get your attention. Beyond all the things which are wonderful and good in terms of learning and understanding and meeting with one another and worshiping and celebrating, will God get your attention? Will God get my attention? Because that's what He wants more than anything, to get our attention. And he is Moses, and God has got his attention. More than that, having got his attention, Moses hears his name. What an incredible thing to hear God speak your name. What if you've ever been in a sort of an airport, and in all the busyness of sort of international flights, and you're waiting there, you suddenly hear your name across the tannoy. You know, it's sort of John Smith, and you freeze and you think, someone knows I'm here. That happened to me. It was an amazing moment. I've got a friend who travels internationally. He arranges it regularly. When he's got long layovers in airports, he goes to the information desk. Pretend his name's Bill Smith. It isn't, but I won't incriminate him. He goes to the desk. He said, I wonder if you could page Bill Smith. He said, what you need to say is, will Bill Smith, who is meeting Mel Gibson, please come to the information point? He does this. And he sits back and rejoices in hearing his name mentioned in public. And then he goes to see how many other people are going to see if Mel Gibson turns up at the information point. There is chaos breaking out in international airports all over the place. But it's that stunning moment when God speaks our name. When God speaks our name. There are a number of incidents in the Bible which remind me of what it's like to have your name spoken. Because Moses wasn't the only one. As I cast my mind through, I thought of 3 distinct situations where an individual had their name spoken by God. And here in your burning bush this week, God could well speak your name in any way, in the same way that these 3 heard their name. There was God who said, Adam, Adam, where are you? Where are you? And there are times this week, maybe when God has your attention, that you will hear your name for the very reason that God called Adam's name. Because he was lost from him. He was lost from him. Adam had disobeyed, had destroyed the relationship he had with a loving God. And God was chasing him down out of love and compassion. You know, sometimes I think we fear that when God calls our name, it's like throwing on the lights and cockroaches scatter for cover. There is nothing fearful about coming under the light of God. It can be a frightening experience if our sin hasn't been forgiven, but God in his love and compassion and mercy, tonight, this week, is going to call your name as he did Adam's and say, where are you? Where are you? Why are you adrift from me? I've got all this love and mercy and compassion and you sing about it. When are you going to come back and be reunited with me because of what Jesus did on the cross to make it possible? Adam, where are you? The nearest I ever got to that was driving somewhere in Somerset. And the police had some system whereby if you were speeding, they clocked your registration number of your car. And as you drove along, there was a little sign that said, would car registration number slow down? I stopped the car and got out to check because I'd forgotten the registration number. That was the measure of guilt that descended. And I realized at that moment that it wasn't that they were out to get me. They were out to rescue me and make sure I didn't do myself damage. When God calls our name, Adam, where are you? It's because it's extraordinarily good news. I think of David. He was 6. He'd been holding on to his mother's hand. And Mum said, don't wriggle free. It was a crowded street. And he'd wriggled. And he'd twisted and turned. And now he was lost. And he was huddled in a little doorway as a 6-year-old, knowing that he should never have slipped from his parents' grasp. And crying. And then he hears his name. David. 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 And there was that strange moment as he knew the best thing in the world he could do would to be flee back to safety to loving parents. But he knew he'd broken the rules and wondered how he would be received. And if that's you, as God calls your name, I want to tell you that there's safety and forgiveness and love and compassion in a Father who welcomes us back. And as you begin a week like this, there can be nothing more wonderful than hearing God call your name and call you to forgiveness and a new relationship with Him. There's the other person who had their name called. It's a New Testament picture of Mary. Very fresh to us as we've just gone through the Easter story. And there is Mary bereft, sad, broken-hearted. Her whole world has ended. All those dreams she had have now disintegrated. And there in the stillness, she hears her name. Mary, Mary, Mary. It's the Savior. It's the risen God. And He's calling her name because He wants to fulfill her dreams and enable her to be the person God intended her to be. You may be here this week with a broken heart. I want to tell you, just as Mary's name was mentioned by God this week, even tonight, God can whisper your name and offer you the loving compassion of the gift of His Spirit, who will be with you, who will wipe tears from your eyes, who will be your friend and companion and restore you to being the person you are called to be. But what about Moses? Here's the 3rd time we have a name called, for a very different reason. Not because he was someone who needed sin forgiven and restitution of relationship. Not someone because he was bereft and crying. But because God had plan and purpose for his life. Moses was called because he was to go. And for many of us this week, that's exactly how God is going to call our name. Because He will call us to go. Now let's be realistic here, can we, for a minute? The theme this week is mission. You think it's the future. The truth is it's mission. We've disguised it a little because we wanted to get you here. We're nice people like that. The heart of what we're looking at this week is, why do I exist as a family or a church and an individual? What sort of values do I need to have? And what does God want me to do with all this? It's about plans and purpose. It's about God saying to us, this is what you've got, and I want you to do something with it. I want you to go. But let's be realistic. We could all go overseas, but it's unlikely that God will call us overseas. Some of us have distinct responsibilities at home, which in God's economy we possibly could not leave because it would be irresponsible to do so. But as you look through the material this week, I hope you will understand that for each one of us, there can be a new step forward. For each one of us, there can be a renewed commitment. For some of us, God will speak our name because things are not the way they should be. Despite all the outward show, the masks are firmly in place. But deep down behind here, it's not the way it should be. And God will mention our name and call us to have a step forward to a new commitment, a renewed commitment. For some, it will simply be a call that as we hear our name, it will be to make a simple step of trust that commits ourselves to go further than we have ever been before in discipleship and commitment to Him. But for some of us, it will be a major step of obedience. It will be a major step of obedience that calls us to make distinctive choices about our future and our destiny, which will touch people and churches and nations. God may meet for any of us for that reason. And as we hear God's voice, as God speaks our name this week, there are a couple of things we need to be clear of if we want to work it out. We need to know who we are, and we need to understand who God is. And what you're about to hear in the next 5-10 minutes or so is really relevant to you if over the last years or months you have heard God's voice calling your name, and you're trying to work out what to do with it. And equally, it provides a context for you this week as you start to work through mission statements. As you wait and say, God, speak to me. It gives you a context that when God speaks your name and calls you, small but significant or great and significant, it gives you a context against which to respond. You see, Moses' first question as he heard his name was, but who am I? Who am I to go to Pharaoh? And if you, as you hear your name called, respond with that, it's the best possible response you can begin with. The most dangerous people who, when God calls their name, says, well, I've been waiting for this. You know, I'm God, just the kind of person you need. What took you so long to recognize my talent? Our churches are overfull with people like that who just wish the church leadership would recognize the abundance of their talents and put them to work. Sadly, for some, they should be recognized, but it's a matter of heart attitude. Heart attitude. The great question is to realize that we have very little to offer God. The beginning of service is to realize that when God calls us, we are actually not up to the task. I remember a time as in my early 20s when I discovered this very painfully myself. My little church decided it needed a new youth leader, and I figured I was just the ticket. I had hair. I knew enough guitar chords to lead Kumbaya. I mean, I was in business here. It took me only a few months to realize that my total dependency on myself was a recipe for disaster. Moses' response to God as to who could I possibly be to do this is a very sane and sound basis to hear God call our name. You see, we also needed to recognize that in this situation, God, that he would also have said, I must be discounted from the task. I mean, who am I? It wasn't just that he doubted his ability. He looked at who he was and realized that there'd been a point in his life when he had significantly messed up. He had significantly messed up. He had decided that he was God's answer. He had decided that he would take things into his own hand to liberate his people. He'd seen an injustice take place, and he'd committed murder as a result. That's why he had now fled to the backside of the desert. He had taken things into his own hands and severely messed up. Severely messing up does not discount us from God calling our name. Yes, there are some issues so far as leadership are concerned in certain circumstances, and I'm not giving a total carte blanche here, and I want you to understand. But friends, basically, God is in the business of cleaning up messed up people and equipping them for service to serve Him. Because frankly, I don't think any of us would be here if He didn't clear up messes and put them in situations to serve. Because we are not equipped. We significantly blow it down through times in our lives. But God, a God of grace, comes and takes the messes up, cleans them up, and sets them to work. Here's Moses realizing he'd blown it, no longer a prince of Egypt, rejected by his own people, hopeless and helpless, and God calls his name. Please do not imagine that all you are left to do in the economy of God between now and heaven is to sing his praises if somehow you've messed up in the past. God wants to clean you up, put you in a new position of service, and enable you to go out and follow him. The other thing about serving him is to understand that it's God's power anyway that does it. Do you remember what Paul said to the church in Corinth? Remember, he says, few of you were wise in the world's eyes or powerful or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God deliberately chose the foolish things of this world in order to shame those who are wise. He chose those who are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things that were despised by the world, those things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important, so that no one can ever boast in the presence of God. Do not be misled by any display of seeming talent and competence up here. You should hear us when we pray before we come here. It's a far more honest statement of our inadequacy. And God wants to take our seeming inadequacies and make us adequate through all he is. My current hero is a 12-year-old girl who cost the San Francisco parking department £1 million. Her ammunition was but a stopwatch, and she did the damage by personally timing 2,300 parking meters to prove they were faulty. I like kids like that. But folks, if one 12-year-old girl can do that much damage with one stopwatch, think what we could do as fallible people if the Spirit of God invaded our lives and we made ourselves totally available to him. On my neighbor's fence, not the neighbors on the other side with the dog that barks all night, I mention that whenever I can. I know vengeance is God's, but I just want them to know that one day they will hear this tape. In fact, I may even put it through their letterbox on the way home. But on the other side is this lovely couple. It was probably their dog that with a stick of dynamite. No, it wasn't. It was this lovely couple, and they, on their fence, they've got this sort of man with a windmill thing. You may have seen them. It's sort of made out of plastic. Have you seen these things? They're astounding things. It's a sort of a plastic man who's got his hands on a kind of crank wheel. And it's a spindle that runs to a windmill here. Have you seen it? And then when the wind blows, the paddles turn, and he here is cranked. And I can read his mind because he's got a sort of a plastic smile on his face. And he's sort of going, aren't I doing a good job? Aren't I doing a good job? And you can see him there. He thinks that he's pushing this, and somehow he's making the paddle to move. I think sometimes he says to himself, I'm beginning to notice that whenever I move my hands, I can actually make the wind blow. Friends, that's what God does. We somehow think that we do it all. But it says, as we simply hang on to the paddle and allow God's wind to blow, that lives change and differences are made. Moses didn't only need to understand who he was, he also needed to know that he wasn't disqualified either by sin or by age. It's a big thing. I really appreciate Ruth rubbing it in as we sat there tonight. Some of you did the calculations. You know, 21 years ago, spring harvest. Wasn't he 36 at the time? Yes, he does have a Zimmer frame. I want to tell you that here is Moses, and he wasn't disqualified because of his age. And nor are you. Just turn to someone over 45 next to you and say, you are not past your sell-by date. Would you do that? And then say, even though you look like it. No, don't say that. Friends, let me tell you that you are never too old to be called into leadership. The problem is those who are called young and remain leaders for a long time and become a stop in the bottle. That's a different issue. You are never too old or too young to be called into leadership or to keep running. I want to tell you that I am determined to finish the race. I've heard people talking about handing on the baton. Can I tell you, I'm handing on the baton in terms of running the race to no one. Do you know what you do when you hand on a baton in a race? The guy with the baton stops running. That is not what the race for God is about. There is no way that I am in a relay race. One day I will have a Zimmer frame and on it will be engraved the phrase, "Let my people go." But I will carry on running the race with God's grace and help. I am handing on the baton to no one in terms that I will then stop running. Because this is not a relay race. I see it more as a cycle race. You know the ones where you get teams of 4 and there comes a point where the person at the front, their legs start to go and they tuck in behind. I'm looking forward to that. There are times when those of us who have been in leadership for a long while need to step out of the stream and get behind some of the younger legs. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of you young guys and girls coming up behind. I want to hear you running that race. I want to hear you panting behind me. I want to hear your steps of holiness. I want to hear your steps of commitment. I want to hear your steps of dedication. I want to hear your steps of reality. I want to hear your steps of being sold out for God, giving me a hard time behind. I want you to give me a race right to the end. And when there comes a time you're lapping me, I will gladly step out of the way so you can run past. But we are never too old or never too young to be called. I've made myself 3 promises. I want to live long enough to cause my children great worry. I want to be buried in an Hawaiian shirt wearing sunglasses, ideally Ray-Bans. And I want that Zimmer frame engraved with "Let my people go." The other thing that Moses needed to understand is that he had what God wanted. Because of the language he spoke. He spoke Egyptian. What language do you speak? What language do you speak? What is there in your past that makes you equipped to hear God call your name? Do you speak the language of pain and disappointment? Have you been through childlessness, unemployment, depression, sadness, grief? What are the history that has been built into you which makes you rich and valuable in God's service? That doesn't discount you but qualifies you to be more useful. What was it that was so rich when my wife went through 5 years of prolonged depression that now makes us much more usable as a family, which shifts my focus to being caring enough to say, let's become whole people rather than broken? What qualities have you got in you, just as Moses had qualities? Because he was concerned about justice. That's what got him into trouble. He was concerned with passion for the poor. That's why he made sure that these girls could feed water to their sheep. What is it that God's built in you that makes you equipped to hear his voice call your name? And just because it's been a long time since God has called your name, it doesn't discount you. He had been 40 years. Please do not sit there and say, but it's been so long since I've heard my name called. Has God got off my case? If you want to know why God didn't call Moses' name earlier, it's very simple. If he'd called his name earlier and Moses had gone back to Egypt, the people who wanted to kill him would have killed him. God's timing is perfect. When God calls your name this week, it's not only because you are not disqualified, it's not only because you've got gifts and abilities that God has built in you ready to serve him, it's because this is the right moment. Finally, let me say this. It's not only an understanding of who we are, but an understanding of who God is. An understanding of who God is. Do you understand how great and magnificent the God is who calls you? A God bigger than space and time. A God bigger than the whole of creation. Because when God made, there was nothing else but God. There was nowhere else that he could put creation but within himself. God is not hiding somewhere out there. He has hidden everything within himself. The God who appears to you, to speak to you, to call your name, is greater than the whole of creation. He's greater than time because he made time. Time is of a different substance to eternity where God lives. God is greater than space and time. This is the God who calls your name. He is also a God who leaves room for mystery. A God who leaves room for mystery. Because as Moses approaches the bush, God says, stop. There will be some things we will never understand this side of heaven. But just because we don't understand everything, it doesn't mean that we cannot hear God call our name. What is this God like? Let me close with a few words that I found on an email someone sent me just a few days before I came away. As you think about God calling your name this week, let me remind you of who God is. God is Lord Almighty, omnipotent King, Lion of Judah, Rock of Ages, Prince of Peace, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. He is the first, He is the last, the beginning and the end. He is the keeper of creation and the creator of all He keeps. He's the architect of the universe and the manager of all times. He always was, always is, and always will be. Unmoved, unchanged, undefeated, and never undone. He was bruised and brought about healing. He was pierced and eased pain. He was persecuted and brought freedom. He was dead and brought life. He is risen and brings power. He reigns and brings peace. The world can't understand Him. The armies can't defeat Him. The schools can't explain Him, and the leaders cannot ignore Him. Herod couldn't kill Him. The Pharisees couldn't confuse Him. The people couldn't hold Him. Nero couldn't crush Him. Hitler couldn't silence Him. The New Age can't replace Him, and TV chat shows cannot explain Him away. This God who will call your name this week is light, life, longevity, and Lord. He is goodness, kindness, gentleness, and God. His ways are right. His word is eternal. His will is unchanging, and His mind is on us. He is my Redeemer, my Savior, my guide, my peace, my joy, my comfort, my Lord, and He offers to rule my life. This God will never leave me, never forsake me, never mislead me, never forget me, never overlook me, never cancel His appointments with me. This God who calls our name, when I fall, He lifts me up. When I fail, He forgives me. When I'm weak, He is strong. When I'm lost, He is the way. When I'm afraid, He is my courage. When I stumble, He steadies me. When I'm hurt, He heals me. When I'm broken, He mends me. When I'm blind, He leads me. When I'm hungry, He feeds me. When I face trials, He's with me. When I face persecution, He shields me. When I face problems, He comforts me. When I face loss, He provides for me. And when I face death, He carries me home. This God is everything for everybody, everywhere, and every time. This is our God. And when He calls your name, please say, "Here I am." Thank you.
Like it's very